the overall question is how matter and energy flow and how they fuel our life processes. Sugars, for example, are converted to amino acids and they're linked together to make proteins. Small molecules are assembled and others are broken down. Interestingly, where a cell is a miniature factory, thousands of reactions occurring all the time, converting energy in many different ways. Some organisms convert energy to light, as in bioluminescence. Well, that's just an enzyme called luciferase. And it functions to oxidizes is taking away hydrogen and electrons, especially electrons, of luciferin. So luciferase is the enzyme, and a lot of enzymes are named after what they hydrolyze. In this case, it's oxidation, and the protein is luciferin. So those are both coded for by DNA. Yeah, so the luciferin comes into the body of the organisms, these are jellies, by diet or absorption. So basically, what metabolism is the totality of an organism's chemical reactions. And it arises from interactions between molecules. It transforms matter and energy and is subject to the laws of thermodynamics. Is subject to the laws of thermodynamics. Metabol in Greek means change. So that's where the word comes from. And a lot of them are pathways. Metabolism isn't just singular chemical reactions, but rather pathways of many reactions, changing reactants into products with intermediates in between. So a metabolic pathway has many steps. Can begin with a very specific molecule and ends with a product. And each intermediate is catalyzed by a different enzyme. Catalysis is a way of speeding up reactions. If it weren't for enzymes, our reactions would take, a very, very long time. We could not survive. So even our exergonic or spontaneous reactions, cellular respiration, it would never take place without the assistance of enzymes in quite a big way, really. So that's a metabolic pathway. These are intermediates. And cellular respiration is a good example of a metabolic pathway, and as is photosynthesis. We're going to broach those two topics in different lectures. And it's all about balancing supply and demand, whether or not you hydrolyze chemicals in the body or you synthesize chemicals in the body. It's all about supply and demand. Sometimes you're breaking things down in order to use them to synthesize other things or for energy. So breaking down complex molecules into simpler compounds, that's called a catabolic pathway. I always think of a cat like with claws tearing something apart. So it's breaking down complex molecules. Cellular respiration, for example, is catabolic. Breaks down glucose. Or catabolizes glucose. Anabolic pathways, on the other hand, build complicated molecules from simpler ones, and that requires energy. As you can imagine, building something would require energy. Consumes energy, requires energy. And yeah, building ATP, for example, from ADP and little phosphate, we get ATP. Synthesis. Breaking down molecules is generally done by hydrolysis. Hydro means water, lysis means break. And fortunately for us, you can pair these two processes in your body. So when you break down glucose, you release energy, and that energy is used to build ATP. And ATP can be used in all your other metabolic processes. So energy stored in glucose molecules by way of their bonds is available for work through ATP. Amazing molecule, ATP. Quite remarkable. We use it up very, very fast. Very, very quickly. So what is energy technically? Energy, we say, is the capacity to do work. Kinetic energy is the energy associated with motion, and potential energy is stored in the location of matter. It includes chemical energy that's stored in a molecular structure, such as glucose. Glucose, interestingly, is relatively unstable. It gets broken down into water and CO2, along with, of course, oxygen. These are small, not insignificant, of course, but they're small molecules. They have less energy. They're more stable. Glucose is a larger molecule. It has lots of energy because it's relatively unstable. It's pretty easy to oxidize. It's pretty easy to oxidize. The capacity to work, the capacity to cause change. There's different ways of describing energy. Yeah. What is work? Work is, for example, moving matter against opposing forces. For example, against a concentration gradient. Moving against a concentration gradient, well, that requires energy. Moving against gravity, against friction. And energy can be converted. So the concept of energy, it's interesting because it's a little bit counterintuitive. So things that are unstable have more energy. And the reason for that is they're more likely to move. Things that are stable have less energy because they're not as likely to move. It's one way of looking at it. So this is an example in the textbook. There's a diver, and moving is spontaneous. Therefore, being on top of the platform has more potential energy. So the movement of this individual, because this individual is moving, that is now known as kinetic energy. So for example, if that person were to be holding a rope or be holding a turbine or something, or a big wheel, with going down with gravity, that person can move the wheel, transferring kinetic energy to the wheel. But climbing up converts the kinetic energy of muscle movement back to potential energy. And in the water, the diver has less potential energy because there's nowhere to go. The individual in the water is less likely to move spontaneously. And there are some laws of energy transformation, the laws of thermodynamics. According to the first law, you can transfer and transform energy, but you can't create it or destroy it. So where do we get energy from ultimately? The sun. Where does it go? Through heat into the universe. We lose it. So we can't create it from scratch. We cannot destroy it completely. So let's see, what's another example? Energy transformation. So a pool player, oh no, that's not a good example. Never mind. Not a good example. Converting energy is how an organism gets energy for its own cellular work. Converting energy. So energy can be converted from one form to another. What are the different forms of energy? What do we mean by different kinds of energy? Well, light. Light can be harnessed to do work in photosynthesis. Heat. Heat is kinetic energy, because heat is the movement of molecules. It can't often be harnessed, however. Usually it's lost. Chemical energy. That's potential energy in the bonds of chemicals. So this individual is consuming food, which is chemical energy. In the bonds of the chemicals. But those chemicals, those bonds will be converted into kinetic energy when that individual runs. So the second law of thermodynamics is such that, where'd it go? That spontaneous changes that do not require outside energy increase what is known as entropy or disorder of the universe. So in the case of this individual, heat is energy that is lost to the universe. It is emitting from the cheetah, and as such, it's moving all the molecules in the air around the cheetah, but that's not going to be harnessed by anything. That's just going to cause more movement of the molecules around the cheetah. Energy conversion. So the energy lost as heat is unusable. That's why it increases the entropy or the disorder of the universe. It's associated with the random movement of molecules. The random, unharnessed movement of molecules. So living organisms, living systems increase the entropy of the universe. We use energy to maintain ordered structures. The patterns and the orderliness of structures are really quite remarkable. So looking at this is the skeleton of a sea urchin. And you can see even by the skeleton how perfectly ordered it is. There's no disorder to it. It's not random, rather it's orderly. And that requires energy. These are the cells of a plant, the leaves of a succulent plant. There's patterns and order. So order increases locally but the release of heat nevertheless increases entropy. All of the reactions required to make order out of disorder release heat to the environment. Some spontaneous actions like water flowing downhill, decay doesn't require added energy. Water flows downhill spontaneously. So some processes don't require energy, such as water flowing downhill and decay. So how do we know if something requires energy or if something's going to give off energy? So there is a mathematical way of figuring that out. And it's called free energy change, or that should be a delta there. Change in G, which stands for Gibbs free energy. So that change can tell us whether a reaction will occur spontaneously or not. So free energy is considered to be the energy that can do work under cellular conditions when temperature and pressure are uniform. So in biology, energy is supplied by the reaction of complex species or chemicals. That energy comes from light, by photosynthesis, or from digestion of foods, depending on whether you're an autotroph or a heterotroph. Energy is stored.
What is meant by energy comes from light?
The energy that comes from light is by photosynthesis. So the light energy is by photons or waves. And that light is its own energy. It's a kind of energy. The light that comes from the sun, it's a kind of energy. So that stimulates photosynthesis. The energy of heterotrophs comes from the digestion of foods. And either way, the energy is stored until required by the organism. They're basically reservoirs. So free energy, how can we figure out what it is? The change during a biological process, like a chemical reaction, it's related to enthalpy, so that's the total energy. The change in entropy, and temperature is in kelvins, S is entropy, and H is enthalpy. So that is total energy or total or enthalpy, and this is entropy, which is influenced by temperature. So that's the equation. And we live at the expense of free energy. So we depend largely on spontaneous change. So free energy decreases as the stability of a system increases. Hold on to that thought. This is one of my favorite slides to explain what this means. So we're looking at the system with a lot of energy, more free energy. It's less stable, so it has greater work capacity. We gave one example already. That's the person that's on the diving board. It will be spontaneous that this individual can just fall and will fall into the water. Thereby, the system becomes more stable. It releases free energy that can be harnessed to do work. And we can calculate what that is if we know what the joules are involved. Another really good example is, say this is a petri dish, and you've just put a bunch of molecules into the corner here, some dye maybe. Well, it will spontaneously diffuse because of random molecular movement to fill the petri dish. So there won't be any net movement after the molecules have filled the petri dish. It's more stable that way. And that's diffusion. So diffusion is possible because molecules move around randomly, like you saw with the Carmine particles. They move around randomly. So, but in this case, this is a very stable state. So not any more movement is going to occur. So if this were the plasma membrane, there might be a slight movement, but the net movement across the membrane would be 0. So at this lower state, there's less free energy because of the stability of the system. So less work capacity. So this is the really important one too, is comparing glucose with the smaller molecules that I talked about before. So say this is glucose. It's quite a large molecule. So it's less stable. And you're wondering, why is it less stable? Maria? You might be wondering that. And the reason it's less stable is because it's larger. And so the electrons aren't as tightly bound around the nuclei of the atoms that are in this particular molecule. So essentially, that's why it's unstable. It's large, less stable. Electrons often further, whoops, I just must have been thinking about furniture, further from the nucleus. That's a little bit simplistic, but essentially that's how I understand it. Because when glucose is oxidized, and oxidation is spontaneous, the resulting molecules will be water and carbon dioxide. And they're more stable. They're more stable because they're smaller. Carbon dioxide has double bonds, and water is a little stable molecule. The oxygen of water is very electronegative, so it's keeping those electrons pretty tightly wrapped around itself. So the point, less stable means more energy. Something moving from a less stable to more stable releases energy because it's spontaneous. And that energy can be harnessed in some cases, especially in the case of glucose, that can be harnessed to make ATP. So we're using that energy to make ATP. So an exergonic reaction is one that proceeds with a release of free energy and is spontaneous. So in a graph, might show here, this is free energy on the y-axis. Free energy here. These are the reactants. The products have less free energy, they're more stable, so some energy is released in that change, and the amount of energy released here, the change in enthalpy is negative. The change in free energy is negative. An endergonic reaction absorbs energy from its surrounding and it's non-spontaneous. So this is shown here, free energy again on the y-axis. The reactants are fairly stable, so it's going to take some energy to form a product which is larger and less stable. And the amount of energy, it can be calculated. Okay. So, exergonic, we talked about that. You can count the number of calories per mole with equipment. And let's see. So, cellular respiration. Cellular respiration is exergonic. It releases energy. This is a glucose molecule plus oxygen. And in this reaction, we'll get 6 carbon dioxide molecules and 6 water molecules. And this is a chain of reactions, quite a lengthy chain of reactions actually. But somebody calculated this at some point in the past. The change in energy is 686 kilocalories per mole of glucose. Yeah, so for each mole of glucose, which is 180 grams, broken down by respiration, you get 686 kilocalories of energy that are available for work. And you can use that energy to make ATP. And I know that seems a little bit abstract at the moment. And when we get to look at cellular respiration in more detail, you'll see how that works. It's actually very similar to potential energy of water that is sitting in a reservoir, and when it gets released, goes down a penstock and it turns a turbine. And that turbine is used to generate electricity, and it's really quite similar. The process is really quite similar. And you'll see it when we look at the actual process of cellular respiration. So reactions in a closed system will eventually reach equilibrium. So if, for example, this were a hydroelectric system and water was going down the penstock here, turning this turbine, well, if it were closed and the water had nowhere to go, then eventually it would just be the same level in both cases. The reservoir would be decreased, and there would be no more spontaneous movement of water. So cells in our body are not closed, they are open. We have an open system, so we don't reach equilibrium. So in this case, we've got food going in, and we're turning our turbines with that energy. The generator keeps flowing, and we release our energy. And it's carbon dioxide and waste. And in goes oxygen and glucose. Yeah, so it's important to think of organisms as open systems. So here's an analogy for cellular respiration. We're not going to look at it just yet today, but there are a number of enzymes involved in this pathway, a number of enzymes, lots of different molecules as well. Glucose is broken down in a series of exergonic reactions. And that powers the work of the cell. Yeah, so it is very similar. And ATP, now we've gone through cellular respiration, spontaneous. That release of energy has fueled the synthesis of ATP. And now we can use ATP. ATP powers all the other cellular work we have by coupling its own exergonic reaction to endergonic reactions. And a cell does three main kinds of work: mechanical work, transport, and chemical. Mechanical, like, for example, the beating of the cilia in your trachea. Transport, like pumping molecules across the membrane, as we did in the lab. Chemical, like synthesizing, dehydration synthesis, synthesizing chemicals. So how does ATP do that Let's take a look at ATP. That's really the key feature of the way cells manage energy. You gotta love ATP, it's awesome. And we generate a lot of ATP, and about half of the ATP that we generate is used, interestingly, in our sodium-potassium pumps in our cells that are maintaining a disequilibrium of both chemicals and charge. And that disequilibrium, well, that's stored energy just waiting to be used. And we use it in things like nervous function and muscle function. So you really have to understand this little molecule, adenosine triphosphate. It's like an energy shuttle. It's very interesting. So here's your phosphate groups, and look at this. There's a negative charge on each of these oxygen atoms attached to the phosphate group. There's also a ribose sugar, 5-carbon sugar, and a base. In this case, it's adenine. So why is this our energy molecule? Why is that? What is so great about ATP? What's so great about ATP anyway? Would you say, looking at this molecule, here I'll enlarge it a little bit, would you say that this molecule, we're going to make a judgment call here, is this molecule stable or unstable? And why?
I'm guessing it's unstable because it has something to do with the phosphates.
Yes, yes. It is really quite unstable because of all these negative charges on the oxygen. You know what negative charges do, right? They go, and they repel each other. And so this is a weak bond, weak. This is also fairly weak. Not quite as weak, but it's fairly weak. And so this phosphate group there, it's easily removed spontaneously. Something else can just attract it, no problem. It's very easily removed. So ATP has high energy in relation to what it's made of, which is ADP, adenosine diphosphate, and the phosphate group. Very, very unstable. Unstable. Exclamation mark. I mean, it just never ceases to amaze me that this small molecule can do so much. It can power everything that's occurring right now in your body. Yeah. So energy is released when the terminal phosphate bond is broken. It's broken with hydrolysis. Hydro means water, of course. Lysis, adding a water, splits it. With the help of enzymes. With the help of enzymes. ATPase. So the P group, I'm putting PI because it's usually referred to as an inorganic phosphate. Now that it's removed from the rest of the molecule, is transferred from ATP to another molecule. And the recipient of that phosphate is said to be phosphorylated. Makes it less stable. So it's like, let's see, what can an analogy be? I can't think of it right now. Why am I thinking? I'm thinking of somebody that's, you know, carrying a little kid, puts a little kid on the ground, and the little kid like grabs onto somebody else's legs. And then that person that's got the little kid hanging onto his legs is not very stable. I don't know why I'm thinking of that as an analogy. Yeah. So the inorganic phosphate that's transferred, that's called phosphorylation. Phosphorylation. So it can be coupled, hydrolysis, to other reactions. So some reactions are not spontaneous. For example, combining glutamic acid with ammonia to get glutamine, well, that's going to take some work, and you can even measure it in kilocalories. But the spontaneous reaction of ATP using water for hydrolysis, well, that's a spontaneous reaction. We're releasing 7.3 kilograms per mole for work. Yeah. Together, those reactions are spontaneous because we're even left over here with minus 3.9 kilocalories per mole. And it does it by phosphorylation. So I think, oh yeah, there's some good examples. So here is a mechanical work. So this is a microtubule that Andrea showed us some of those in the cytoskeleton poster there. And this is some molecule that's being transported. And this is a little motor protein here. This little red jobby down there, that's a motor protein. So it's going to change shape and bind and release, bind and release. That's how it walks down this molecule, this tubulin, microtubule. Yeah, so it moves because this is phosphorylated, and then when it releases, it does the actual movement. And then another phosphate molecule will come along, attach to it and release. And it's that attach, release that causes it to bend. It's like here's the molecule. It's like attach, release, attach, release, attach, release. So it moves in that way. Interesting. So that's mechanical work. This is transport work. So here's a channel, a membrane protein. Well, in order to move molecules across the membrane, it has to change shape from this shape here to this shape over here. And it does that because look, here's that little phosphate. It's glommed on to the molecule, and by releasing, has changed its shape. So it's like, it's this way, attach the molecule, it's this way and this way, this way and this way. Yeah. And then the one we just saw with the glutamate and ammonium making glutamine. The phosphate has just attached here and caused those two to bind together. So how do we regenerate ATP then? We use it all the time. with remarkable frequency. And if we were to stop making it at this very moment, we would use all the ATP we have up in 1 minute, be gone, poof. So we must keep making it, of course. We must keep regenerating ATP from ADP and phosphate. And where does that occur? Cellular respiration. So in this case, energy from catabolism, that's the catabolism of glucose. You can take ADP, so it should be there. Make ATP, and then we can hydrolyze ATP and get energy for other processes. It's a cyclic thing. It doesn't really stop, fortunately. Very fast. A working muscle recycles its entire pool of ATP in less than a minute. 10 million molecules consumed and regenerated per second per cell. 10 million molecules consumed and regenerated per second per cell. It's a renewable resource, so we likes it. Okay, I'm going to stop there before we get into enzymes. Thanks for watching.